Okay, so we've gotten the housekeeping underway. Again, welcome everyone. I am just going to quickly introduce Mike Boyle, our presenter for today. I have been thrilled to work with Mike the last couple of weeks getting ready for this webinar because he's so passionate about what he does. He's involved in training, he's involved in webinars, project management, GDPR, the hot topic of the day. Just really so excited, passionate about everything he does. And he's really focused on delivering value to his clients and to us as SIETAR members. The other thing that he really is into is experimentation. And that's one of the reasons that we're experimenting with the format today. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Mr. Passion, Mike Boyle. Mike.
Well, thank you very much,
Take
Steve.
it away.
I will make a note to myself that the next time I give a webinar, I need to go ahead and bring you in to do the intro because, of course, it can't go wrong after such platitudes. Thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
And thank you all for joining today, giving us an hour of your time. Very appreciative of that. I'd like to go ahead and piggyback on some of the things that Steve said. For us to learn means that we need to be able to make mistakes. And so Steve and I haven't gone ahead and performed a thorough dry run and all of that, what we're going to try today. But one thing's for sure, we're going to learn a lot. And I don't discount the possibility of us making a few mistakes along the ways, but that's okay. I'm making an assumption here that most of you are probably in a somewhat similar situation as I am, that you are based in, of course, in wherever you're based, and you have clients in multiple countries. And so we don't always have the possibility to actually go ahead and physically meet with our clients always, or at least looking at it from my perspective. I've had clients that I've never met. I've had colleagues that I've never met. Much part of my world. And so every opportunity that we have to use technology in a better way, which allows us to go ahead and get a little bit closer to the individuals that we're not able to physically meet, allow for dialogue that's much more running in much more smoother manner, so to speak, that it's clearly in our interest. And so I thought from all of that, it would be good for us to go ahead and give this a go. Bit of a description as concerning the agenda, of a little bit more information about myself. As you probably have guessed, I'm originally from North America, specifically United States, even more specific, Los Angeles. But I have called Vienna my home since 1989. There was not really the plan, but that's the way things worked out, and I certainly don't regret it. About 5 years ago, I decided, after 25 years working for various multinational corporations, to go ahead and set up my own company. And Steve already mentioned some of the things I'm dealing with, and of course the subject matter that we all deal with SIETAR is one that's near and dear to my heart. And so I felt it was extremely important to see if I can merge two of my worlds, because they're so clearly intertwined. But before I could do that, I need to give you a proper description of what Agile is, and I suspect that a number of you have heard the term Agile. The beginning of this webinar is dedicated to describing more in detail, and certainly if you have any questions while I'm explaining Agile, please feel free to go ahead and raise your hand and let me know so I can go ahead and have those elements covered. Explaining what Agile is, describing what the components or the various parts of Agile actually is, and then we'll get into the interactive part of the webinar today, talking about the cultural impediments tied to setting up an Agile team. Before we get started here, and I already see I'm going to need to put on my glasses so I can read the chat. I stumbled across this quote a couple weeks ago, and I thought it was very poignant for that of what we're talking about today. And this is coming from Madeleine Albright. For those of you who are not familiar, she was a former Secretary of State under the Clinton administration back in the 90s. And she just came out with a book titled Fascism, A Warning, which I thought was extremely poignant today. As you can see on the screen, quote from her: "In uncertain times, many no longer want to be asked what they think. We want to be told where to march." And this is this real dichotomy that we have. On the one hand, we're supposed to be adaptive. We're supposed to react to this dynamic situation we find ourselves into. Specifically, I would say this is not just pertaining to work life, but I think in all aspects, everything is very dynamic. But the fact is that people are always looking for a how-to. And again, I'm speaking primarily from my experience. When I deal with abstract concepts, people are always asking me, can't you just go ahead and give us the steps that we need to do to get the job done? So they're looking for step number 1, of course, leading to 2, 3, and 4. And we've gone through this through society, certainly for the last 150 some odd years since the Industrial Revolution, where we haven't allowed people to be creative. We more or less sent them into the factory and said, okay, now you're not creating something for yourself anymore. You're creating something for me, and this is all that you need to do. So there's a lot of conditioning that's taken place for a long time, but we realize this conditioning no longer works. So what does the world look like today? I would say instead of being linear, it's actually spheric. And if you think about this model that you have on your screen right now, there's an interrelationship between all of these lines, meaning that if you perform some sort of action to one part, it immediately has an effect on the other parts. So let's think of how we can actually go ahead and apply a linear approach, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, into this model. Well, you can, but you can only take one of the small boxes, because what you don't want to do, or what you can't do, is plan for the for all of that of what you see on your screen. You can only take one component, see what happens, make adjustments, and then move on. And that's really what Agile is all about for me. Agile means that we stop pretending that we can predict things that we can't predict, that we don't plan things that are unplannable. We plan as much as we can. We start in the beginning. We do what we can. And we follow the scientific method. We plan what we can plan. We execute. We look at our results. We make adjustments, and then we give it another round. And I think this one model that you see on your screen is one of the guilty culprits. As Steve mentioned, I'm coming from the project management world. And so the typical questions you get are, of course, how much is it going to cost? How much time will it take? And of course, this part on the top, the scope part, we say that it's fixed, but it can never really be fixed, because we don't know what we don't know. And so what I've done, there's an actual phrase for this concept you see on your screen. It's called the triple constraint. And what it means is that if one of the components are changed in any fashion, it immediately has an effect on the other two. Case in point, if you're having problems with the cost of your project, then what are your solutions? Then you reduce the scope, that of what will be done, or perhaps you take longer, that sort of thing. But really, what we're missing within this model is the actual value. Just because we're delivering something doesn't mean that it actually brings value. So I tweaked the triple constraint a little bit and replaced the word scope with value. So now how does that actually appear for us right now? then it's always a one-to-one relationship. The cost that you have and the value that you can expect, or the time invested and the value you can expect. And so that changes the dependencies that we have. And of course, it's very important for us to continuously check to see if we're actually bringing that value. That means there has to be some sort of validation process. So for me, that on a very high level, that's what Agile is all about. Not trying to plan things you cannot plan. Do what you can, fail fast, fail soon, and validate your findings constantly. One last model, then I'll go ahead and talk about the competencies. I actually do training in Agile. I'm sure it's not a surprise. And so I'm always thinking of different models to really bring the point home. And this model that you see on your screen, we have two components that are to a certain degree related to each other, that being risk and probability. Let me go ahead and explain to you my terms, my definitions better said for these two terms. Risk for me is an unplanned event, because we could actually have positive risks, which I know for many of us in Central Europe, it seems to be almost an unheard capability for us to have positive risk. But if you think about it, if we don't know what's going to happen, sometimes things happen on that quite well that we never really planned. So what are the risks, the chances of risk actually taking place, and then the probability of us being able to plan right. So if in the beginning of a project the risks are high and the chances of us getting it right aren't very high because we don't have the experience. So the idea here, and I'm going to, speaking of experimentation, as you can see here, on the first iteration, we have a probability of us getting it right of 10% and of us having risks at 90%. So the idea is to ring fence what we're actually trying to accomplish so that the actual risk isn't that high, and we can plan to a certain level pretty easy. Once we find out whether our ideas are correct or not, then we move on to the next iteration. So the idea, by the end, you've actually got to a point of where you have no risk and a very high probability of getting things right. Okay, let's see if we can do that. Yeah, okay. So let me go ahead and talk to you about some of the components that are tied to Agile. Bit more history on Agile. That it seemed to be tied primarily to software development, although I think that we're really talking about a mindset. And instead of actually going ahead and looking far into the future and having to adjust to the things that we didn't know, taking shorter iterations and being much more dynamic. And one of the key components of putting together an Agile team is that it's cross-functional. That means that you have the diversity of people from different departments that are involved, and very often, certainly within software development, we have the customer involved as well, to make sure that we're able to look at what we're trying to accomplish from various aspects. And of course, by having people coming from different domains or different sectors, even very possibly, it allows us to eliminate bias or certainly reduce bias. And I know I'm speaking to the converted in purporting the value of actually bringing in diversity, and cross-functionality clearly goes ahead and accomplishes that goal. So cross-functionality is part of Agile. We have smaller teams, and we get past the silos that we have within organizations. And perhaps if I can, at this point in time, give you an example of how we would actually go ahead and deploy that. I can give you an example from an actual project that I had a number of years ago. This is back in 2000. I was part of a team here in Europe that needed to come up with an e-commerce strategy within 10 weeks because we promised our clients something and we didn't actually have something. So we had people from IT. I was actually representing operations. We had somebody from marketing and sales. And so the idea was to be able to look at that of what we're trying to accomplish from all kinds of different perspectives to make sure that we're actually bringing value specifically to our clients. As it was, we were able to go ahead and put a prototype together within 10 weeks. And in fact, we were able to sell our first license after our presentation 6 days later. So it worked out quite well. I don't think it would have ever been possible had we not been able to get representatives from the various departments, because otherwise we would have been looking at primarily from just IT. And we would obviously have been missing all kinds of various feedback from the rest of the organization. So that was very, very important. And another big part of Agile is the autonomy and mastery. The idea is that you have smaller teams, and they are given the power to go ahead and make decisions on their own. So by nature, if they are allowed to go ahead and make the decisions, then they hold the responsibility for the results, in comparison to having a boss telling them that they need to go ahead and complete things in a certain period of time. Within Agile, we believe that the people who do the work know the work the best. So why don't you empower them to go ahead and make those decisions for themselves? As mentioned, that's a very key component of Agile. So let me just go ahead and check to see if we have any questions so far. Are we doing okay? I see smiley, so that looks okay. Let's go ahead and continue. Then the last part that I'd like to go ahead and focus on, it's within Agile. Yes, sorry?
I can interrupt. The smileys.
Yes.
There was a question, where are the ladies? There's a lady.
There's a lady. I'm sure there are ladies here. I'm not sure, but that's a very good point. That when we're talking about diversity, then we're actually talking about bringing in not just male and female, but obviously different nationalities with the various culture that's tied to it. So yes, that is a very good point, and I have noted that point. Thank you very much. Okay, the last point that I'd like to raise is specifically tied to Agile, is getting something done. In comparison to just spending all your time planning, the idea is to bring value quicker to whoever's looking for it. And so to cross something off your list, moving from the to-do part to the done, is very important within Agile. Okay. So maybe before we move on to the second part, perhaps to just go ahead and check and see if there are any questions apart from any possible faux pas I might have made tied to any inherent bias I might have had. No questions?
If you have any questions, just type them in chat. I have a question, Mike.
Okay.
As you've been working in this area for a while now, what kind of shift have you seen in organizations from going to perhaps over planning to taking a more agile approach to business?
I hear a lot of lip service. And usually it's a case of where the CEO hears about Agile being the silver bullet for a number of high-tech organizations, and they feel that, oh, then we'll go ahead and take a linear approach in the how-to, and we'll go ahead and implement Agile that way. And what they all don't realize is that we're really talking about a mindset. Nobody can go ahead and tell you how to run your business. You need to be able to decide this yourself. And so what that means that you need to get everybody within the organization believing in following a more adaptive approach. And I think the real key is that the individuals in the organization need to feel empowered. Because if they don't feel empowered, they're never going to stick out their necks and make some decisions. And that, for me, is the greatest impediment that I'm running across constantly with regards to Agile.
Yeah.
So you didn't directly answer your question. I think you were looking to hear, are we making progress? Yes, no. I actually think that to a certain degree it's getting worse, because the business thinks this is a way to treat IT as a production line.
Mm.
And in fact, that all this autonomy and mastery, especially within IT, gets pushed to the side, and it's a way for the business to more or less ensure that that IT, whether there's any value in that production or not, is sometimes questionable.
Mm. Okay. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
We have a hand raised. One
Okay.
moment, Julia. I'm going to give you the mic. Just a moment.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay. Julia, you
are on mute.
You're muted.
So Julia here.
Julia.
Thanks for the introduction, and I would like to add a question to the question we have heard before about to do and done.
Mm-hmm.
In multicultural teams, project teams, have you imagined or have you observed that there's a very different understanding of what is done and what is not done? And the same I always observe with planning. You know, I'm German, and the Germans like to plan their whole life. It's a joke. I exaggerate. And the same is, I worked a lot with Koreans, with Spaniards, and so on. And the imagination, when is something ready? What quality does it need to have? And I think that this can be one of the obstacles, beside others, of Agile in multicultural projects.
Oh, Julia, you're going to love the rest of this webinar, because that's exactly what we're talking about. That's precisely the issue. Because just to piggyback on what you said, and thank you very much, I agree wholeheartedly. In certain cultures, the plan is the deliverable. In other words, nobody's really talking about value, but rather we're talking about we're finished when we have a good plan. But the fact is, we cannot plan what we can't plan. And where it gets really interesting is when you go to teams and say, all of a sudden, you're empowered. You are able to make your own decisions now. And they'll go ahead and say, well, that's great. So what do I do after that? And so this is a real issue. And in fact, that's why I was so thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about this subject here, because this is a huge issue, obviously, in all projects, but especially with regards to Agile, and how we get together as multicultural teams to actually go ahead and work properly, especially tied to autonomy and mastery. So I'm keen to get additional feedback. I have some examples where I'm hoping to get all kinds of interesting input from all of you. And just as a precursor, I took some examples from a book that I suspect that a number of you are familiar with, and that would be Writing the Ways of Culture. It's been out for a couple of years now from Fons Tampelman. Sorry, let's go back. I can't see the name. Sorry, apologize. Can I move this? Yes, I can. Oh, and Charles Hampson Turner. Book I read a number of years ago, and I thought it was a good precursor to see some of the situations that they actually talk about within the book and how that would apply to our situation. So without further ado, let me go ahead to come to the first example. One of the points that they talk about is this mindset that we have, either following a sequential approach, and I think, Julia, what you were referring to, and I hope I'm not being offensive in any fashion, is that would be very typical that I would see within Germany. I'm come to the realization after a number of years that actually there's a strong tendency in the United States to think that way. And I live in a country that is not so sequential. I live in Austria, and probably more sequential than a number of places, but in comparison to what I consider the norm to be, it's actually very random. And so the real question is, when you, and I'd like to go ahead and pose it as a question, and then see what kind of feedback that you can actually go ahead and give back to Steve and myself. So how do you work with a cross-functional team? And I'm talking about piggybacking on what Julia said, a multicultural team where you're going to have individuals that belong to both of these groups. Those that need to have things taking place one after another, and there are and then you have other individuals within your team that thrive on a lot of different tasks taking place all at the same time. So how do we actually go ahead and manage that? Anybody like to go ahead and take on that subject? I'd be very keen on some of your feedback. Steve, I don't see when people raise their hands, so maybe if you can help me here.
Yep, we do have a couple of comments in chat. Don asks, isn't Agile predicted on action orientation, whereas many cultures are reactive, passive? And Veronica responded, yes, Don, it is. It's one of the reasons Agile and Scrum are less popular outside the US and Western Europe.
Oh, I'd like to piggyback on that statement. Does that mean that all Europeans fall into that model? I would strongly disagree with that. I could think of a couple of nations that actually do quite well with this model, and they actually thrive. Any idea of which countries I might be thinking of there?
Which model are you referring to there, Mike?
The idea, piggybacking on the comments that coming out of North America or the U.S., that it works quite well. There I would also have questions, but might not necessarily be appropriate for Europe, if I understood the question properly. And I could think of some countries that actually thrive on this model. Anybody have any idea which countries I might be thinking of?
Don says perhaps it's a function of a tension between sequential and randomness. Randomness, seeming impasse between the Brits and German and French.
Yeah. Could you elaborate, Don? You want to take over the mic?
Veronica also has her hand raised. We can
okay.
Get to her
Let's
in a
give
moment.
it to Veronica then.
Okay. Okay, Veronica, I'm going to open up your mic.
Can you? Yes, I've got. Thank you very much. I was the one who made the comment about Agile and Scrum being less popular outside the US and Western Europe. And I will agree absolutely that it can be useful in many different cultures. It's simply that just as was being discussed about the sequential access versus the random access, and the cultural perceptions about how linear work is and how linear life is in projects has an effect on how popular Agile has become in some cases and how it's been picked up more quickly in some than others. But that's all I was mentioning.
Okay, no, thank you very much for that. I'd like to piggyback on some of the things you just said. I could think of 5 countries where Agile and Scrum thrives. One is Holland, where they are, in my mind, they are extremely agile. And I would go ahead and lump all of Scandinavia into that group, although here we probably make some differentiations. I would say that definitely Finland, Denmark, perhaps in Norway, perhaps a little bit less than Sweden. I'd put them all five in a very strong agile scrum. And what are some of the characteristics that all these countries have? One, they believe more or less in a flat hierarchy, so that makes the cross-functional teams that much easier. Secondly, they're very direct in their language, and so that makes that part also much easier. There's less of a chance of losing face. And thirdly, I think that they are very keen on, I think that they're, for the most part, pretty sequential, which also makes it easier as well. And of course, I'm being very general, and one of the comments that I saw in the chat, it was tied to the organization. Of course, we have a number of layers that play a very important role as to whether Agile would actually work or not. I think one of the big issues, I'm sorry, I think we have some side conversations actually going on, if I'm not mistaken. We actually,
okay, sorry, Mike, to interrupt. Yeah, Veronica just lowered her hand, but Dawn has her hand raised.
Okay, great.
So, Dawn, I'm going to open your mic. Oops. Okay.
Yep.
Yep, we hear you.
I was just wondering, the fuss I'm in London, and the approaches to the Brexit negotiations seem to be on either end of this spectrum, if you put it as a spectrum. The Germans are planning and processing and working things out and get to their ideas. The French do it by logic, and the Brits do it by suck it and see, or the wing, as we would call it here. Random, and to my mind, the random way might actually get us somewhere in the end. But it's frustrating for people who are, in this respect, using a much more sequential process.
Thank you very much for that, Dawn. I very much appreciate it, because I'm trying to follow the chat to a certain degree and follow the conversations. One thing's for sure, I'm not putting any value judgments on any of this, because we're all different, and thank goodness that we're different. The real key is, how do we go ahead and make things work when we're all coming with different approaches, and how to actually go ahead and settle issues. I think sometimes you just need to experiment, although one can question some of the ramifications, especially considering that there's a very strong deadline tied to Brexit. Who knows what's going to happen out of it? I totally agree. So getting back to the question, if we had those three teams with British, French, and German, so how would we go ahead and solve the issue in how we actually go ahead and approach the work? Any ideas? Dawn, are you still there?
Yes, I am. Oh, sorry, was that a question to me?
Yeah, why not?
Well, I have one idea, and is that for both of them to try and understand the mindset of the other people. I mean, there is a real reluctance to understand culture, actually, not by the civil servants but by the politicians, particularly in the UK. They just assume this is the way they've always done things, of ducking and diving, and it's going to work. And it might well work, but in the meantime, there's an awful lot of frustration.
Mm-hmm. I think that happens on the micro and the macro level, what you just said. And so if we think about the first step, I agree wholeheartedly. How do we go ahead and make those cultural components aware to the respective sides?
Veronica has raised her hand again. Maybe she could jump back in.
Please feel free, Veronica. Yes.
Oh, Michael, I just wanted to add in, one of the big issues that I think relates to both Agile and using Brexit as an example is one of the big aspects, in my opinion, to a successful Agile is the trust factor. The team has to immediately trust that everyone is, that the like you were saying, the scope or the value of the project or of what's going to happen is the right project and is the one we're going to focus on. Whereas, of course, for example, in Brexit, even though that's been chosen as what's going to happen, there are quite a number of people who are not on board with that. And then you also have the aspect about trusting your experts. And so if I have, for example, my expertise is not IT, but if I'm working with IT people, if I'm working with engineers, then I have to trust that their skill set and that they are completely on board and that they're looking out for the best option and not for their own benefit, if you understand what I mean.
Sure.
And I think the aspect of the sequential access and the a lot of Agile and Scrum focuses on being as brief as possible, and in many cultures that ruins trust and the whole trust factor. What do you think?
Excellent point. Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. And so getting back to what Don was talking about, and that was a great follow-up, we need to go ahead and understand, so what are the cultural factors that are actually influencing the behavior that we find on the other side? Because in essence, we're really talking about norms here. We're not talking about values. We're talking about the way that we do things. And by nature, we don't think about it. We just do it that way. We've never had to think about why we do things the way we do. Of course, this group is a little bit different because, for the most part, and here I'm making a big assumption that a number of you are probably in a very similar situation as myself, living outside of the country you were born in. Obviously, being totally enthralled with the subject that's all near and dear to our hearts, looking at things from the perspective of the others. But we all know that that's a process that you need to follow. So the real question, getting back to either looking at from Don's perspective, that being we have the three groups, how do we go ahead and instill this ability to look at from the other's perspective so that we understand that's why they approach it this way, so that you don't necessarily look at them being either sequential or spontaneous as being a value judgment. So how do we actually go ahead and make them aware? What are the prerequisites that we need to go ahead and make progress? Any ideas? Let me go ahead and throw something out.
Veronica's raised her hand again.
Okay, great. Veronica, please.
One of the things that I would say you need is to not have competition. For example, I work, my background has been in sales, and if you want a team that work together, then you cannot have a win-lose situation within that team. And that is one of the core aspects, again, like I was saying about building trust, is just agreeing that it's going to be a win-win situation and having trust that all of the different groups that are involved are looking out for the best benefit of everybody else, and not only for themselves, is a key to Agile.
Oh, it is, and I think one of the problems I totally sympathize with that of what you said, and I come from a situation where I was the bridge between business and IT for a long time, because the business always had difficulties telling IT what they want, and IT couldn't ask properly. So somebody needed to be the translator between that means you were able to talk to business in business speak, and you were able to speak to IT in IT speak. And I would say, and I'm generalizing, of course, this all depends on a lot of different factors, but for the most part, the IT are the sequential people in this model here, and business is the random part. And so you need to be able to explain to both parties why they do what they do, so that you foster more of an understanding. And I think you need to do that before you can actually get to the trust, because once you get to a certain point and people react the way they always do, then people are going to the corresponding teams are going to think, oh, they're not to be trusted because they're not taking my interests into account, whereas it has nothing to do with that at all. And so you need those translators, I think. Getting back to Don's example, because I think it was I'm really fascinated with the subject. How do we come up with translators to go ahead and explain to the Germans, the British, and the French why the other side does what they do? And you would think on that level you should have these translators, but obviously either they're not being listened to, or perhaps we just don't have enough translators to actually go ahead and perform that.
We have a couple of comments here, Mike.
Excellent.
First, Elizabeth, you made a point that she posted on a moment ago, very similar. Elizabeth said, I think one way is to make people aware of the advantages and disadvantages of each way of approaching a project.
Exactly.
Yep. Okay, Aletta, I'll come back to you in a moment. Rosella posted a while ago, several minutes ago, different region. We are working in the Middle East, especially Iran, on a project. Establishing a procedure, it's incredibly difficult as they have no idea about Agile and so on. We feel like they like to be told what to do rather than being empowered.
That's a real issue. And so when I think about the original commentary, I think it came from you, Veronica, if I'm not mistaken, that works well in the United States. We have some difficulties in Europe, and I would say certainly it all depends where in Europe, as I gave in the example. I think that in certain regions of the world, it's extremely difficult. And I have no visibility on the Middle East, so it would not be fair for me to make any comments, but I could imagine that being the case. I'm thinking also about Asia, where nobody wants to lose face. Nobody wants to say, no, it doesn't work. These are all big issues.
Mm-hmm. And Don says empowerment is a function of the strength of hierarchy.
Oh, can you elaborate on that one, Don? I'd like to understand that one better.
Yulia, empowerment is a very Western tool. Okay, Don, I'm going to open your mic up.
That was a good one, Yulia.
Don, your mic is live.
Absolutely right. Empowerment is a very Western concept. I'm biracial. I'm half Indian and half British. Irish actually, but there you go. And certainly the idea that you should be proactive and take the initiative and do things like that in an Indian context is seen as presumptuous, where in the UK is also sort of under the radar, can often is seen as presumptuous, but the rhetoric is all about being empowered. And more hierarchical, or the higher they score on hierarchy, the less likely people are going to feel empowered.
And Veronica adds too, patriarchy is also important in how a group might react.
Yeah, and this is exactly, in an Indian context, patriarchy is much more important than in a context.
Yeah, I really like that comment about empowerment being a Western tool. And in fact, I think part of it is the question tied to individuality. Because there's a clear lineage or linkage, better said, between empowerment and the individual being able to master things. Whereas I think when you come from a group culture, that could be extremely difficult. But I've also noticed, especially when you come from highly individualized cultures, the group work isn't that easy, because usually you've built it on systems where the individual gets rewarded for his or her own tasks and not necessarily based upon the group work. So that makes the group part of a cross-functional team extremely difficult. Maybe if I can go ahead and move on to one of the other...
Yeah, just quickly though,
sure.
Aletta has the answer to the Brexit issue between the British, the French, and the Germans.
Okay, great.
The answer is bring the Dutch in.
All right.
And with that, you may move on, Mike.
Okay, great. I would follow up, but I might be best to move on. I think that this is another very important point that needs to be looked at, specifically tied to agile teams. And I think we did talk about this on a certain level. The juxtaposition between putting more of a emphasis on relationships versus rules, where when you think about looking at the typical framework within Agile, we have our team together, they go ahead and make a decision, they just decide how long it's going to take. If there's no opportunity to actually go ahead and build up those relationships, and that was a comment that was made a little bit earlier that was extremely poignant, that's a serious issue. On the other hand, you have certain cultures where rules are extremely important. So how do you actually go ahead and cover these two components within a cross-functional team? Any thoughts, team? I almost think you have to come up with various levels of how you go ahead and move to Agile, or
Okay,
what are your definition of Agile? Sorry,
says I haven't understood the question.
Okay, yeah, sure. The question is, if we're trying to come out with a cross-functional team, especially looking at it from a multicultural perspective, if you have members of your team that take almost a diametrically opposed view in how things are to work, either they put more of an emphasis on relationships or they put more emphasis on rules. How do you manage those types of teams?
And Veronica has her hand raised. Moment.
Okay, great.
Okay, Veronica, go ahead.
Hello. One of the issues that I think might relate to that was it's very much also has to do with what kind of a problem you've got. Because when you want a creative solution, rules don't work. But so, for example, if we're using Brexit, we have never had to deal with Brexit before. So the rules that existed were made as a general guideline without knowing how it would work, what other issues would be involved. Rules in general are for when you know that there's a standardization that you can make. Just like in IT or in business, when you're making workflow processes, those that you can standardize and explain in simple yes/no questions, those are the ones that you can create rules for and also put into IT. Those are the same ones that you can focus on. And by discussing that with team members, do we know what the solutions are? Do we know what direction we're going? Or do we have to be creative? If it's creative, then it has to go into more of the relationship perspective, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Any other comments?
Elizabeth also added that it was a bit of a question of whether you want compliance or engagement. And I think that also ties back into what we were talking about patriarchy versus empowerment as well.
Sure.
Because the comfort level of, do you want somebody to sit quietly, do what they're told, and feel safe? Or do you need people who are willing to go out on that limb, try different things, in which case you have to trust that if you fall backwards, if you make a really bad mistake, or if something goes really wrong, that the rest of the team are there and that the people who are supporting this project are there to say, yes, or, at least you're trying.
And then I think it brings us to the point of fear of failure, because nobody wants to lose face. And certainly if you think that very possibly you might be blamed for something that goes wrong, then you're never going to stick your neck out to try something that you've never tried before. I think that's extremely important. Sorry.
Are you aware that that's actually that there's several areas of Asia where they don't have the being perfect isn't such a big deal. If I want to say in the West, I'm also, by the way, I'm also an Angeleno who's living in Europe, in the Netherlands, and we're raised from this. You have to do everything right. You have to show off that you know what you're doing and that you're the best. Is the direction to go. And yet there are examples of other cultures who focus on the process of being persistent, the process of learning, the process of striving is actually far more respected than getting the answer right the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And that Asian perspective can be really valuable in compensating for our Western fear of failure.
Right. And so thank you very much for that, because that's a great example of how we can actually use the power of diversity to create something much bigger than we would have ever been able to have created otherwise. And here I'm going to add something new to the equation. When we assume that rules are clear in why we go ahead and follow rules, is very often leading us to a huge assumption, basically, that eliminates this being able to pose the question why. I see very often models that are created that people think, well, this is the way that we do things. Nobody knows why we do it this way. Well, actually, they do know, because it's always been done that way. And for the most part, they're never really questioned. But the fact is, a number of rules, and I'm looking at it from a corporate perspective, a number of rules were established through happenstance. In other words, they needed to establish some rule at some time, so they arbitrarily decided what the rule was. And of course, by the time through time, the individuals that created the rules, nothing was ever documented. And so you get to the point, these are the rules. Nobody knows why we have these rules, but these are the rules. And then they always try to create solutions that are based on rules that have no value. So that's a serious problem. I would like to always have people on my teams that are willing to go ahead and question why we have these rules to begin with. Not in a negative sense, but just in an inquisitive sense. And I think that if we're able to go ahead and show those people that are firmly believers in rules that maybe there isn't always that value to the rules, and maybe you can do things easier, maybe you could do things more productive, that maybe this could be true freedom, that you don't always have to rely on these rules that you've been told throughout your entire life is the way that you need to go. That would be an opportunity for those that put more value on relationships, for them to show the other side there's another way of approaching it, and showing the value of taking different approaches. But again, I think we run across a situation where it's not that easy. I believe that this constellation also applies to the Brexit, because we have certain nationalities that very much belong into the rules camp, and that makes it extremely difficult.
Mike?
Yes?
I apologize. I really hate to break this news, but
we're finished.
We're almost at the top of the hour.
Oh, wow.
This has been an incredibly interactive session. It's been great, and time has flown by.
Can I take 2 minutes still, just to throw someone? Okay,
yep.
Thank
you. Just want to let you know we're at the end.
No, I appreciate it.
Julius says, what a pity.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out some other concepts, because I think we were all moving in the same direction. Clearly, this was something that we talked about, the group versus the individual. We already talked about that to a certain degree. And of course, in retrospect, I know that we could have just taken one slide and spent the whole time talking about one slide. And then the last part I wanted to cover, which I think was very important, I'm going to leave this as food for thought for all of you, status versus achievement. So how do you bring this together in cross-functional teams, multinational teams, where you always need to deal with all of these things? And if we take the United States of Europe as an example, we know that we're running across conflicts on all of these points. And so with that, I'm holding to the rules. Stephen, and I'm going to edit that. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining. Like I said, this was a bit of an experiment. I very much appreciate your time, loved your input, and I wish we would have had a lot more time. Thank you.
You're getting a lot of thank yous here. Again, I will add my thanks to Mike for leading this incredibly informational, interesting discussion. Appreciate all of your interaction. I think our experiment was a success, Mike, with opening up.
Yes, it was a success. I already have my lessons learned for the next time.
Good. Okay. We've all learned something. Really appreciate it. Everyone, thank you also for your time. The next webinar is scheduled for, just a moment, July 5th. And it will be led by Faith Mubin. This should be very interesting. She is an asylum seeker in Finland and is going to be speaking on religious persecution on the rise. The substantive freedom is under global siege. So please go ahead and register for that webinar. And with that, again, many thanks to Mike, many thanks to all of you, and wish you a great evening, afternoon, or day, wherever you might be, and see you on the next webinar.
And I wish you all a very pleasant weekend to boot.
Oh yes, it's the weekend.
Yes.
Schönes Wochenende.
Yeah, ebenfalls. Yeah, thanks a lot, Stephen, for all your help.
Take care, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.